Welcome to Legacy Conversations, a channel where we preserve military memories and history.
Hello, Internet. We are back. I'm excited, when I speak to Laurie Shochat. If you haven't seen his videos, man, so it's been a few years. Well, if it's been that long, it's been quite a while. But anyway, he's back and he's welcome here. Thank you for coming back. And he's a Savannah, Ops Savannah veteran. I think he's from SAI, if I remember correctly. Yeah, and today we're going to have a very special episode, but you explain yourself. Over to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So this is the fourth session, and I hope it's going to be an eye-opening session this time because it's not just going to be telling the story of Savannah, but it's going to be actually a homage that we're going to pay and respect that we're going to pay to all those who died in and around Savannah during the time that I was there. Over the last at least 10 years, I've been researching and interacting with different Savannah groups and personally with people who were in Savannah with me in Angola, if it's not personally with me, but around the area. And I accumulated quite a bit of information that is going to cover those who died. I think this is a very, very interesting and personal a journey that I want to take you through and share with you. I've got a lot of information, and I think if I look back at South Africa, and it's almost 50 years ago, people died on the border, but died in Operation Savannah up in Angola. Their families and the general population knew nothing about what happened at the time, years later, and now even 50 years later. They just disappeared off the map. There is an annual get-together in Pretoria that pays homage to them, but the personal stories are not out there. This is what I want to share with you. So it's going to be more of a presentation where you will see quotations and interactions from people, pictures, original documentation. So let's get on with it. Okay, so here I am sharing a couple of slides that I want to share with you and put perspective, first of all, before we start covering the stories, the individual stories of those that died. Let's put some perspective on Operation Savannah and the war in Angola. So just very briefly, going back where the original border war started back in August 1966, there were clashes with SWAPO on the Angolan border with Southwest Africa. And that's basically where the engagement is widely regarded in South Africa as the start of what we know as the border war. Operation Savannah was one of the first major events of that border war, but it actually started all the way back in August 1966, and the police forces were actually patrolling the border at the time. And then in mid-1967, for those who remember, there was a universal conscription of all white South Africans. We all had to start going to the army. Originally, it was 6 months and then 9 months. And when we eventually went in 1975, it was a year. In May 1967, the base in Rundu was put together and set up for military operations there. And in 1973, there were insurgents that started coming in the Caprivi strip. Before we went to the army, all the stories on the border war were always about Caprivi. And that's what took place just 2 years prior to us. And then when in 1974, the number of events was so major that the police were replaced by the South African Defence Force. And then what eventually led to Operation Savannah actually was that in April 1974, there was this Carnation Revolution in Portugal with the right-wing government that eventually took over and then decided that they have to get out of Angola. And that's what was happening with a lot of colonies all across Africa and in the East, where the governments decided they had lost enough of their own soldiers fighting the local insurgents. And they basically packed up and they left. And they said that by the November the 11th, 1975, whoever controls Angola will be recognized as the formal government in Angola. So South Africa at the time, and I'm going to just read this quickly, believed that if the MPLA succeeded in seizing power, it would support the plan, which was the MPLA military wing, and lead to an unprecedented escalation of the fighting in Southwest Africa. While the collapse of the Portuguese colonial state was inevitable, Pretoria hoped to install a moderate anti-communist government in its place, similarly to what the Americans actually did in Vietnam, if we remember just a few years before that, which in turn would continue cooperating with the South African Defence Force and work to deny planned bases or MPLA bases on Angolan soil. This led Prime Minister Foster and the South African intelligence chief to embark on a major covert action program in Angola called Operation Savannah. Now, just one little tidbit that's not here is that South Africa actually received the support of the CIA at the time, which at the time was also pushing. They were involved in supporting the FNLA in the north of Angola, in the east of Angola, but there was no solution to the south and center of Angola. So there was a cooperation between the United States and South Africa, very much behind the scenes, very much, very, very secretive. I've told the story of how we eventually got up to the Angolan border from SAI in Walvis Bay in August 1975. That's where it all started, where we went to protect the hydroelectric scheme. I don't think Operation Savannah itself was actually formally declared at that time. We were actually only going up to the border. That was in August 1975. So we can see hundreds of South African troops, that's us from SAI, crossed to South African Infantry Battalion, crossed into Angola and occupied the Kolek and Ruacana system over there. I myself was in Ruacana. Some of the guys were in Kolek. And even though the objective was to actually just protect the installation, we were seeing thousands of Angolans fleeing, refugees fleeing Angola because of the murders and that are taking place over there. Thousands of people were being killed. And then at some stage, the plan got together that we cannot carry on like that. South Africa has to get more actively involved. And that's where Operation Savannah started. In mid-October 1975, we donned camouflage clothing. We took off our South African identifications, and then we started rolling up and going up into Angola. That was the start of Operation Savannah. Let's put a little bit more perspective on it and cover the casualties, because this is what I'm going to be covering. During the Bush War, the SADF suffered 1,791 casualties. This is taken off an official website, while SWAPO lost about 11,500 guerrillas. Casualties in the total Bush War over the period of about almost 15 years runs into several 100,000. Now, Operation Savannah itself was from mid-October to mid-February 1976. All in all, about 34 South African, I'll say about, because sometimes who's included and who's not included can be, can be a little bit of a gray area. But from information I have, 34 SADF soldiers were killed. Of these, 12 were in accidents. I will cover some of those accidents as well. I will be covering now essentially not all 34, but at least those who died or were killed during the period of my involvement in Operation Savannah. So I can talk about them a little bit more personally. I've got stories and documentation that I can share with you. So things that happened after I left Angola, which was on the 10th of December 1975, I'm unable to cover because I can't vouch for all that, and validate that information. So if we look over the period of South Africa's involvement on the Southwest African border and then also into Angola, we see a long series of operations over a year, almost 40 operations throughout this period. But as you see, it actually started with Operation Savannah, all the way through to Operation Agree in 1989. So this was an ongoing bush warfare, but Operation Savannah was the one operation that was not only the first one, but it was the only real major operation where South African troops went in and conquered over half of Angola. We were 1,500 kilometers up in Angola, about 100 kilometers away from Luanda at the time. So without ado, I'm going to start with all those that passed away and died tragically. The first one was actually before Operation Savannah even started. We flew up the infantry troops from Walvis Bay on the 12th of August, one day before this event. We flew up, the infantry troops flew up and the armored cars drove up, okay? They arrived the day after us, and I was at the airfield in Ruacana just getting some radio equipment when all of a sudden we heard shooting from within the building. We knew that just a few hours beforehand, the armored cars which had driven up had arrived and they were out there on the airfield. I'm going to tell the story now, the brief story of Corporal Potgieter, who you can see here on the armored car, painted yellow because it comes from Walvis Bay. The armored cars usually were green and not yellow. And here we see him with his team of 3 of them in the armored car. Potty died on the 13th of October, 1975. He was the first casualty, and it really brought back home to us the dangers of what was going on around us. And I'm going to quickly read the story of what happened, as told by his fellow teammate, Sam van der Berg, who lives in PE. So my gunner, Philip, used the traveling time to recover from the hectic leave period as a driver. I did not have that privilege. Our crew commander, Potty, he was the crew commander, was a dedicated and diligent person who mostly kept me company during the night and for the rest of the trip. At 1800 hours, we arrived at Ruacana Airport. The vehicle was parked in a typical H formation, which you can see over here, with the armored vehicles parked in 2 lines, with the soft skin eshel vehicles parked in the center. So the armored cars were lined up. Gunners were instructed to clean the weapons. Potty decided to do that himself, while myself and Philip started a fire to a couple of meters in front of the car to heat up the rations. Suddenly, a burst of Browning machine gun fire broke the early evening silence, and I heard the snap of bullets passing uncomfortably close. We heard a shout from our car and realized that something must have happened to Potty. Our troop commander, Lieutenant Andre Venter, was the first to respond. He jumped onto the car and tried to lift Potty from the turret. Another single shot rang out. This shot hit Lieutenant Venter in the lower back. And this was just 2 months before Operation Savannah. I'll continue. So before I go to the next guy, I just want to give a personal note of here. So I was inside the building at Ruacana. We heard the shooting. We had no idea what was going on. The reports came back. Now, 6 o'clock in the evening, it was getting dark already. And I'll never forget this scene. We didn't have any lights on the airport. There were no lights on the tarmac there. So what happened is that they had to evacuate both of these injured guys. And what they did is the armored cars drove up along the runway, and they shone their lights on the runway. There was one Cessna plane. They put both injured guys in the Cessna plane, and with the lights of the armored cars, they flew off to I think it was to Rundu, where later on we heard that Potty actually had died, and the other guy, Lieutenant Venter, actually survived this episode. So We had only just arrived. We had been there a couple of hours, and the first guy from our unit had unfortunately already died. Then, just 2 weeks later, on the 28th of August, 1975, we're now going to talk about a rifleman, Senegal. There was a town just across the border. You see the border over here, the line of the Southwest Africa Angola border over here. A town called Pereira de Esch, which we met up again 2 months later in Operation Savannah, where the Operation Savannah actually started with the taking of Pereira de Esch. But 2 months earlier already, the town of Pereira de Esch was occupied by the South African Defence Force on the 22nd of August. On the 27th of August, it was attacked again with the Parabats, B Squadron of 1 SSB, and also there was C Company of 2 SAI, C Company being our guys from Walvis Bay, as well as the D Squadron, which is, we've just covered them now, which is the armored cars of 2 SAI. And the first South African national serviceman to die in action on the border, remember the previous one was an accident, to die in action on the border, the Angolan border, was Senegal of 2 SAI. There was a press release released by the SADF indicating that he had died in a shooting incident. No location was provided, no details were ever provided, in the same incident, there were also 2 that were wounded. On his gravestone, which you will see here, all it said was died on the Angolan border. Nothing more. His family were never told exactly what happened, but it was actually he died in battle, and he was the very first one. Remember, this is all prior to Operation Savannah actually taking place. And Hans Verhoef, the 2 guys who actually, over the period, this was Hans Verhoef wrote in 2014 already, that I was outside Pereira de Esch with the 81mm mortars that day. I will remember that day very well. It was the first real firefight I ever experienced. In training, one gets used to the sounds of gunfire and targets, etc. But on that day, I realized the gunfire was knocking out our lives, theirs and ours. It was a sad day, and Senegal had his life taken away. I was just 19 at the time. Anyhow, I'm not going to read everything over here. You've got it on the screen. You can go through it. There's another guy, Wimpy Breert of C Company. He wrote at the time to us, to the team in Afrikaans, that there had been quite a few combat units involved, as we discussed earlier. And he goes through exactly what happened. We had to quickly jump off the Unimogs, lie down to avoid being taken out. And after more and more shooting, we then continued north. During this process, Gert, Senegal, and Jan Nel were left behind. Shortly afterwards, Gert was fatally shot, and Nel, I think, was shot 2 times in the lower body. Gert died on Nel's lap, who, as mentioned, was wounded himself. Nel returned after being at one military hospital for a period of time and told us exactly what happened. I had to go and tell the whole incident to the family. It was not a pleasant experience. So here we've got actual evidence of the guy who was with him at the time and ended up having to go and tell the family what exactly happened. The next person who died was unfortunately also an accident where, once again, over here, I had a personal involvement somehow in this, albeit afterwards. This is from the South African War Graves Project that anybody can look up, that covers all those that died in and around the border war, not just Operation Savannah. And I'll tell you the story briefly of Rifleman Skippers. And I'll tell it from the perspective of those who were there. Starting with Bruce Kirby, a good friend on the Savannah group. Leon Skippers was part of our Charlie Company 2 SAI. And in September 1975, we were crossing the Kunene River, just north of Ruacana. The river was flowing very strongly, and Leon got washed away, and his body was never recovered for a couple of days. Brian Pfister wrote, I carried that boy's body on the stretcher once we surfaced from the river. It was something I will never forget. It was the first dead person I came across in my short life. Little did I know what more was coming our way. And then me, myself, there we were at the customs post in Ruacana. I was a signaler, so I'd heard about the story, and days passed until, a vehicle came into our little base that we had there, and the body was brought to our border customs outpost in Ruacana. We laid covered with a blanket until an ambulance came to fetch him. Some of us peeked under the blanket, and it was curiosity to see if we could recognize him from Walvis Bay. And it was a big mistake. Because there we were, 18-year-old troopies. We'd never seen a dead person in our lives before. We hadn't experienced death. And after 3 days in the water, it was a gruesome sight that stayed with me for many years. And with me too, as with Brian Fisser, it was the first time we had seen a dead person, and it left a big hole in us. We then moved forward into Operation Savannah itself. So here I've covered 3 people who died or were killed prior to Savannah up in Angola. And then Operation Savannah kicked off. It kicked off in about the 17th of October. We went up and we conquered a whole lot of towns from Sada Bandera. We made ourselves all the way up to Benguela and then to Lobito on the coast. And on the 7th of November, this is Captain Schoeman, and this isn't now a young 18, 19-year-old conscript. This is a permanent force officer, age 31. On the 6th of November, Battle Group Foxbat continued its advance towards Lobito. Just to put perspective, we were in Battle Group Zulu, which we came and we made our way through to Lobito up the coast. And then there was Battle Group Foxbat, which came out from the center of Angola, making their way west. So it was almost like who was going to get to Lobito first. So they were advancing to Lobito, and they were ambushed as the enemy that was fleeing from Lobito. Remember, we came and we took over Benguela and Lobito from the Zulu force, and those that had been in Lobito were fled. And then they met up with a group of Foxbat. And unfortunately, that's when Captain Schoeman actually died. And we managed to destroy and capture 18 vehicles, but that's negligible. Basically, what we do have is a documentation here. You'll see here a regional documentation from the 7th of November. It's called a SITREP report, saying that 13 were killed and captured, and then Captain Schoeman was killed himself. So this is a regional documentation. We see another one here at the bottom as well, that there was a mine incident. So let's go over the actual incident itself. On the 7th of November, Battle Group Foxbat destroyed another convoy of 15 vehicles trying to escape northwards from Lobito. Captain Schoeman, the commander of the armored car squadron, attached to Battle Group Foxbat, was fatally wounded by a landmine at the T junction. I'll never forget this because I was on the radio, monitoring all the activities on the radio when we heard about this. This is a T junction that basically went from Lobito going up north, and the T junction was coming in from the east. So they came in from the east. They got to this T junction. He got out of his vehicle, and boom, unfortunately, he stepped on a landmine. He was flown to one military hospital in Ruacana, where he actually died from his wounds 2 weeks later. On November the 23rd, he was 31 years old, and he left behind a bereaved wife. Captain Schoeman was the first killed in action on the South African Defence Force since Savannah started on the 14th of October, 3 weeks earlier. So years now, we've already experienced 1 or 2 people killed, not necessarily in battle in Operation Savannah. Captain Schoeman was the very first one. And here you see pictures that maybe I even took. I don't recall that. But these were all the senior officers that I was involved with in the HQ of Zulu. You will see a couple of people over here who you'll see the commanding officer over here, Colonel van Niekerk of the Zulu. You will also see Commandant Kotza over here, I was his driver and signaler. And here you see us sitting around. I'm not in the picture, but this is actually a picture sitting around inside the Lobito airport, which was totally riddled with bullets and a total disaster area in itself. And this is just standing outside the building where we discovered like some little hand rocket launcher that they were playing around and testing. So here we see Commandant Webb. This is Commandant Webb and Major Holshausen of the battle group Foxbat, who they came to visit us, because the forces actually met up. And we spent most of the day together in and around the destroyed airport building. And they updated us on the events of the day before. This is, after Captain Schoeman died, the senior officers pitched up at us at the airport and told us the stories. And now we go through to a little bit later, 2 weeks later, on the 12th of November, 1975, we have the sad story of Rifleman Bartholomew Venter. So after the capture of Benguela and Lobito, Task Force Zulu was given orders to continue the advance up north towards Novo Redondo. And bear in mind that this was roughly now the day before, he died on the 12th, the day before the official celebration of Luanda of Independence Day, which was on the 11th of November, 1975. And this is the official day that the Portuguese left Angola, and they said, whoever is in charge of Luanda takes over. So we didn't manage to get to Luanda on time. We were just 100 kilometers south, or just over 100 kilometers south of Luanda. We hadn't reached there. MPLA were in charge of Luanda, and so they formally took over the government at the time. So under Commandant Linford, the Elands came under mortar attack. And at the time, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but while we were in Sada Bandera, a few weeks before that, we received notification. In fact, I received the first notification where a bank manager came running up to me to inform me that he had been in touch with a bank in Lobito, and they had seen hundreds, if not thousands, hundreds at the time, of Cuban forces arriving. So what had been unknown to us at the time was that now Cuba was involved against South Africa in Operation Savannah. Now, this wasn't information that was available or known to us at the time. The Cubans had been secretly bringing in troops and advisors into Angola even before Operation Savannah started. So by the time we got up to Lobito and further up north, the Cubans were actively involved in fighting against us. So over here, the Elands came under mortar attack from the Cubans, and 2 of the armored cars were destroyed in the battle. 11 of the enemy were killed, and in order to provide cover for the Elands, the mortar platoon were brought in under Lieutenant Okamp. But unfortunately, this mortar platoon, as they were setting up, a mortar shell actually hit them, and 19 of them were wounded. One of them was Rifleman Venter, who was actually killed. There was a long battle, lasted until dark, and then only thereafter the wounded were evacuated. Now, the story of the evacuation of the body of Rifleman Venter was also a story in itself, as told here by 3 of the guys who were involved in both the attack as well as afterwards. They had to go back into the area to go and to extricate his body. So Sam van der Berg wrote, that night we slept about 30 kilometers south of Novo Redondo. We received the news of the ambush that he wrote that an RPG round had hit the car, which had a 90mm gun on it, on the tip of the barrel. And part of the projectile penetrated the armor, injuring the 3 men. And up to that stage, I'm just continuing a bit further on, we felt so secure in our armored cars But when you saw what an RPG can actually do and penetrate the steel objects, we still found it and found its way into the hull and into the crew. It made us realize our vulnerability. Then Leroux himself wrote that he was involved in the contact, and then afterwards they drove out to try and get the body out. I remember the moaning of the wounded men that night. They were treated in a makeshift hospital set up underneath a ground sheet. A report in the Transvaal newspaper on the 17th of November, which I don't have, but that he mentioned, okay, reports Venter's death. Typical of the secrecy of this operation at the time, it was reported as a terrorist attack on the border. The remaining 12 members assisted the wounded throughout the night until they were evacuated with a Dakota from a nearby airstrip. So even at the time, there we were up in Angola, the rest of the South African, even the defense force, but the general population knew nothing about what was going on and that South African troops were up in Angola at the time. Here we just have official documentation mentioning the actual event itself. It's not all that clear, but that this does deal with Venter's death. And now we can go through to, and then we had a period of relative quiet. Now, in parallel to Operation Savannah's Zulu force going up on the west coast of Angola, there were other forces already, other task forces on the center and even in the eastern side of Angola. And the Battle of Ebo, which was a very famous battle, and I wasn't there myself, so I'm going to limit myself to the information that I'm going to share here. And it's going to be first-hand information by guys who were actually at Ebo at the time. So what happened is that Foxbat were up in the center of the country trying to get through towards Luanda from the center. We were trying to do it, the Zulu task force from the side of Novo Redondo. But what the Cubans did was they blew all the bridges on the western side in the center of the country. And these were major rivers. So the South African troops could not cross over these rivers. We continued trying. At some stage, they said to us in Zulu, go join Foxbat. So some of the Zulu forces remained behind in Novo Redondo, and the rest of us, and this is where I actually left the second in command of Zulu, Commandant Kotsa. And I joined Major Frank Bestbeer. I became his driver and signaler, and we drove down from Novo Redondo. We drove down towards Lobito, and then we moved east into the center of the country, and then up towards Sela and Santa Comba, where all the Foxbat troops were. And the day that we actually were going to arrive in Sela is when the Battle of Ebo took place. Ebo is a small little village just behind some hills and mountains where South Africa was trying to find its way through to go north. And they thought that if they try and attack Ebo, from there they can make their way through and find their way. We unfortunately had not been able to join them at the time. We literally arrived a day afterwards. At Ebo, which was the first major calamity really for South Africa, it was the first major defeat of South African troops in Angola. 5 South Africans were killed. The Cuban military, and I'm going to read this, anticipated the South African advance towards Ebo, because it was like a bottleneck, and it was the only area that had any kind of possibility of the South African troops getting through. And they realized that. Nevertheless, the South African Defense Force still decided, let's give it a bash. And they were unaware of this Cuban force waiting for us. So the Cubans established positions there in a river, in a river crossing. And And the defending artillery force were equipped, very well equipped, with a BM-21 battery, a 76 field gun, and several anti-tank units. And they subsequently destroyed, and I'm not going to get into the details of the actual story too much. I wasn't there. There's been a lot written about it. Some of it's accurate and some of it not that accurate. And they destroyed 7 or 8 of our armored cars, which got bogged down. It was very muddy at the time. There was rain in Angola every single day. It was the rainy season. And they killed approximately 50 UNIT and FNLA troops that we had with us and 5 South Africans. I'm going to briefly try and cover, I'm just going to move this to the side here so we can see the writing. So the guys who actually died were as follows. I'm going to try and quickly cover the 5 casualties that we had. So we've got Trooper Lombard. On Sunday, the 23rd of November, 2 groups of inland armored cars, this is the story of Ebo, moved towards a bridge over the Masaba River north of Ebo. The driver of the first car, Trooper Lombard, was fatally wounded when they drove into an ambush at the bridge. Lombard was killed on impact when his car was hit by the projectile of a 5mm, maybe 50mm recoilless gun. After the control of the vehicle was lost, it overturned and ended up in the river. Second Lieutenant Johan de Toy and Corporal Jakkals van der Merwe were in the car with Lombard, and they both survived the attack. They managed to leave the vehicle hours later and escape on foot. An armored car that was left behind and fallen into the ditch, and this was the armored car that Lombard died in. Lombard's death was only became known when his fellow troops, de Toy and van der Merwe, managed to reunite with the group. They didn't know about it for a number of hours. Plans were made to recover the body, but reports from a reconnaissance plane where there was so much activity at the bridge, it was impossible to intervene and to go immediately and recover the body. It was decided to leave Lombard's body, and on Tuesday, the 25th of November, the decision was communicated to the headquarters of 101 Task Force that night. Lombard's body could not be recovered, and it took 37 years, listen guys, 37 years, until the burial place was finally found and his body returned to South Africa. And Lombard then became known as one of the Ebo 4. There's a long story. I'll cover a little bit of it a little bit later. So that's the story of Lombard. He was the first guy in Ebo, but the battle continued throughout the day. The next one on the 23rd of November was Staff Sergeant Benson. The Cubans and Angolans, these are what I'm reading to you here are taken from people who were with the troops at the time. I'm not going to mention all their names now, maybe at a later stage, but that was shared in our Angola group. The Cubans and Angolans were deployed, at least 4, had deployed 4 single-barrel 122mm rocket launchers about half a kilometer from the bridge. With these weapons, along with the mortars and machine guns, they kept the South Africans in checkmate. For Captain Holm, the priority now lay in rescuing the trapped armored cars who got bogged down and were shot at. 7 elands had already been shot out, and the crews were bravely trying to rescue one another, some of them on foot. There were amazing stories of bravery over here. I unfortunately can't share them with you, and I leave that to the guys who were there at the time to share their stories. And to try and get out of what was known as a killing zone. The artillery of Major Venter had already reached Ebo, but without any forward observation. We were going in with no information whatsoever. We didn't have any idea where the enemy was, and we ourselves were apparently sitting ducks. So without any choice, Captain Holm actually ordered his mortars to advance right up to the heights and deploy there. The positions were very poor, and they were located in open ground. In minutes, the first salvo of enemy counter bombardment crashed into Staff Sergeant Steenkap's mortar position. Seconds later, a second salvo also hit the position squarely, and Staff Sergeant Benson, who had only been in Angola for 2 days, he had just arrived, and he was going to actually replace Staff Sergeant Steenkamp. He was killed instantly, and Steenkamp himself was seriously wounded. Lieutenant Van Niekerk's mortarmen tried seeking shelter, but the enemy salvos quickly killed 7 and wounded 19 UNITA soldiers in the vicinity. Now, just keep in mind, so this is information that I received at the time. We were literally 50 kilometers south of Sela, making our way to the area. At the time, we were unaware of what was going on over here. Now, the third person died was Trooper Forcraft, also on the same day. And by the time the leading FNLA infantry company had kind of arrived, they reported that 27 of their soldiers had been killed. So this was a massacre. This was a massacre taking place. When we talk about the FNLA, there were FNLA and UNITA troops. We had different commanders, some of them recce's, who had trained these troops in South Angola prior to Operation Savannah. So these were black Angolan troops, and 27 of them had already been killed and many more wounded, including the Portuguese commander of the platoons. Under heavy fire, Captain Harris, the company commander, and Corporal Dietrichs, I've noted it specifically because we're going to get back to Corporal Dietrichs, became one of the most famous recce's ever, succeeded in pulling back the survivors. At the SADF mortar positions, only 4 personnel remained. Lieutenant Van Niekerk, Warrant Officer Jeff Berger. He was my Sergeant Major, who I went up into Angola with from 2 SAI. I'm going to cover him as well a bit later. And 2 troops. Now, Sergeant Major Berger himself was not a mortar guy at all. He was a signals guy. But he was there with him, and I'm going to tell the story about him a little bit later. However, this small band deployed 150 meters south of the airlines, whose vehicles now had been stuck in the mud, finally managed to put accurate fire on the enemy's positions and to slow down that attack and enable the South African troops to escape relatively unharmed. As for Lieutenant Swanepoel's vehicles, the Eland of Corporal Talyat received a direct hit onto the turret. In a panic, the driver, Trooper Volgraaf, jumped out and began to run back towards Ebo. However, an enemy sniper shot him in the stomach before he could reach safety. The rest of the crew, Corporal Talyat and Lance Corporal Adams, saw that the driver was injured and they went to rescue him. They then physically carried him out of the danger area and up to the mortar position. And then they took him with a Honda, they took him back to Sela for treatment. He, however, passed away later that night. So here's the guy who unfortunately also got caught in the crossfire, got shot, and we managed the troops, his fellow troops managed to pull him out, and they thought they were bringing him to safety. They did, but his wounds were too severe. The 4th and the 5th last casualties of Ebo, which I'm going to cover now, are Captain Holm himself, who was the officer in command, and Corporal Talyat. So Captain Fourie, after seeing, who was in the background apparently, after seeing what was going on at Ebo, began to assist in the rescue missions to retrieve the surviving airline's crews. His crew was quite successful in this. After his Lieutenant Albert succeeded successfully in reaching the position of the destroyed airland, which he quickly loaded up Corporal Botha and his gunner Visser, and he brought them back to safety. Again, they entered the killing zone. So these guys were going in and out, and succeeded in towing back to safety 2 of the damaged airlands, which stood in the road. And then tragedy struck. With Lieutenant Van Niekerk away busy transporting the injured Volgraaf that I mentioned to the medics, Warrant Officer Berger and his 2 assistants continued their lone mortar war against the vastly superior Cuban artillery. Sergeant Major Berger got a commendation for that. He got an honorary Crook's medal for that operation. I wasn't with him anymore. He left me back in Sada Bandera. We had been together from the beginning all the way up to Sada Bandera, and the two of us split up. Get back to him. And after another salvo of 122 millimeter rockets crashed into his position, he decided to withdraw. This is Sergeant Major Burger. They eventually were forced to withdraw and take cover. And on his way back to Ebo, he met with Lieutenant van Niekerk, who had completed his medical run, and warned him not to go back to the original mortar positions, as the Cubans had successfully worked out the range of the location and were accurately firing onto the position. Lieutenant van Niekerk, however, still had to return, and in order to assist with the loading of the mortars. And seeing that Lieutenant van Niekerk was busy with the mortars, we have other guys who went to assist the mortarmen in loading the mortar pipes onto the back of the cargo trucks. And while this loading was still in progress, I'm just going to move you guys over here for a second. So while this loading was taking place, Captain Holm also arrived in another eland, and he was one of the senior officers in charge at the time. And as he stopped and leaned out of his vehicle in order to warn the two armored soldiers that they should hurry up, that the Cubans had successfully bracketed the position, another salvo of 122 millimeter rockets struck home. And Captain Holm and Corporal Talliard were both killed immediately. With the other two guys were both wounded, and they managed to be taken to safety. And this was almost the final story of the Battle of Ebo. But Operation Savannah wasn't over yet. Here what we see is the actual map going up towards Ebo. You see here's Ebo where the battle took place. This is the road trying to get to the north, as you can see. The day after Ebo, myself and some of the Zulu troops, forces that came from Novo Redondo, we arrived in Sela, which you see at the bottom over here. This is where there was an airfield that flew troops in and out, and of course equipment and what have you, in and out from South Africa, from Southwest Africa, and Rundu. Everything was flown into Sela, and from there was a road north to Santa Comba, all the way up to what is called the Neck. This is the series of hills that actually was the dividing line between the South African troops and the Cuban troops. So this is the Neck. It's a very, very narrow byway where the road continues here north towards Luanda. And this is where Breach 14 was, by the way. And so they had blown Breach 14, which at the time we couldn't get past, which is why from the Neck over here, the South African troops took this road to the west towards Ebo to try and make their way through over here. You will see as well, there's a place called the Pig Farm. This is where we actually ended up for a couple of weeks, for over a month, in fact, just guarding this border region between us and the Cubans. On the right-hand side over here, you see the official top secret communication from November 75 from two South African military, military area to 101 Task Force. This is back in Rundu, to say that there were 4 dead at the time. So this is the original. Everything was handwritten. There were no computers in that day. So all, communications, everything was handwritten. And here you see Captain Holm, Benson, Talliard, and Volcroft. There's a whole story by Rowley Medlin, who was a sergeant major who led for many, many years like a monthly a newspaper of sorts for sergeant majors around South Africa. And he was very involved. And back in and I'm just going to read a few things that he wrote on Ebo in 2006. This was. He was in touch with me actually by email at the time. And back to Friday, November the 28th, the notification of the incident was, there's some interesting historical information here. The notification of the incident was received from the South African Defence Force headquarters in Pretoria, and they in turn notified the military units closest to the residential addresses of the next of kin, instructing the officers commanding to convey the tidings. And all it said was, your son is missing, presumed dead, and that any other further information will be given forthwith. Over the weekend, the official communication of the SADF was published. The South African Defence Force announced today that at least 3 soldiers are missing in the operational area and believed dead. So they were really pulling the wool over everybody's eyes. Nobody knew anything, where they already knew that, these guys are dead, and they couldn't, just come to the realization that they've got to tell the full story to the families. There were also newspaper clippings that told the public that 2 were pilots and that the 3rd was an infantry officer. The clippings also made mention that there was a reconnaissance mission that went missing. The parents were devastated. Here, the South African Defence Force was saying that their sons were missing, presumed dead, but could produce no bodies, could not or would not even tell them where their sons had crashed or what would go on, or what actually happened. So we're going to continue to the next guy, who was Trooper Gideon Obbes. And I mentioned earlier on that we actually left troops on the Nova Redondo area from Operation Savannah Zulu Force. We were now joined the Foxbat Force in the center of the country. And here's the story of what happened to Trooper Gideon Obbes. Major Upton asked us to inspect a bridge north of Nova Redondo. So we're back on the west coast, still trying the South African troops with some of the recce's trying to find a way through to cross the rivers there. Why we only used 2 cars for the exploration, I do not know. The 60 millimeter, there were 60 and 90 millimeter guns on the Elands of Gideon Obbes and Van Rensburg and Wessels drove in front of me. Me and Jeff and Danny Milan were in the 90 millimeter Eland behind them. The left side of the road was absolutely impossible for armored cars. To the right was a bit of an abyss and then also a high hill, also impossible. Left and right of the road, we had a lot of green vegetation. The 60 millimeter fired first. The car stopped suddenly after being hit by Cubans. Gideon jumped out of the car and there was intense fire followed, and he was about to get back in the car when he was fatally wounded. We could not see Fapla being the MPLA. We could not see Fapla's position and just fired in the general direction. Our car turned around and sped back. Danny made another U-turn and we stopped next to the 60 millimeter Eland. We were then a real big target for them. Everyone knew that the Eland was built only for 3 members. And luckily the 2 guys they just climbed onto the vehicles and they didn't get in. And there was still fire on us. So you can imagine 3 guys inside and 2 hanging on the outside. And we left our mates there and chased the Fapla out. Steph kept firing at the enemy until the ammo was finished. He and Wessels then later got out of the car unseen and used the cover of darkness to return to us. Steph and Wessels were safe after a terrible experience. Stefan Rensburg received the Honoris Cross decoration for his bravery. And this is just one of a number of stories as we go through where guys just came out and put their lives at stake, sometimes just to recover the body of one of their fellow troops. The recovery of the body itself was a major event, because there we have a body out there. The Cubans can see everything. How do you bring the body back? Gaius Parker wrote, I don't know exactly when this was, but this was a good couple of years back as well. The loss of Corporal Beachy who had died back in October in an aircraft accident, and driver Lombard the day before at Ebo, both with who we had trained. Now, these were all guys in the armored unit. So they had trained with both of these guys back in Bloemfontein, hit us hard. And this made us realize that we were fighting for our lives. We believed that every day could be our last day. And it made us even more determined to do our best to survive. We believed that every day could be our last, and it made us determined. I've read that. At Nova Redondo, we were called together to discuss a battle that had taken place with other troops in the armored cars from D Squadron to SAI. These were our guys. The outcome was grave, and as one crew member, driver Gideon Obbes, was missing in action after the battle, so they didn't know exactly where he was, and it was unknown at the time if he had survived or he was just injured. We expected the enemy to be ready and waiting for us when we went to recover the body, or to go and try and find him in the battlefield. We were told that Gideon was actually lying in grass not far from the road where we were hit. It was agreed that all 4 armored cars would go there with the guns blazing in full firepower at the Cubans, just to keep them down, to duck down, so that we could try and find where he was. This we believed would keep the enemy's heads down long enough and we could carry out our task. My Charlie Airlines armored car tasked to pick up Gideon was situated in the middle of the 4 armored cars. We soon managed to locate him lying in the grass on the side of the road. Driver Botha expertly turned the airlines towards the enemy to act as a shield for when my gunner Ace and myself went to retrieve driver Obbes. I could see that his injuries were terminal, and this had a great effect on us all. We had lost another one of ours. And Jeff Rendalik wrote, Ben was in the initial fight, so we knew where the enemy was. We led, and then there was Lieutenant Nicolau from the other car, and we started by taking the bend and turning left and started firing. Other cars could drive past us doing at the same time. One car stopped, the crew jumped out, recovered Gideon, and they jumped in the car, and we retreated back to Nova Redondo. So here we have another story. Lieutenant Nicolau received the Honorary Cross decoration for his bravery. So here we see once again, for every single event, we have stories of bravery. We guys, just got out and put their own lives at stake in order to help others. Now, I just want to, before we maybe tie up this particular session, Koos, I want to mention 2 guys. I call it the unsung heroes of Ebo, okay? And also later Breach 14. These are guys who didn't die in fighting. They actually didn't die in Operation Savannah, but they both have subsequently passed away after Operation Savannah. The first one was Andre Dietrichs, the Recce, who I actually had some interactions with that I've mentioned in one of my previous sessions, where he went up almost alone, just with one other person, up on one of the hills overlooking Bridge, what was Breach 14, a few days prior to the Breach 14 battle, and played a critical role in the success of Breach 14. I had actually met up with Andre Dietrichs in Santa Comba, in a little house there, and I actually trained him on the use of the radio, and we communicated how we're going to communicate together. He was like sending me the messages, and then I was passing it on to the 5.5 vehicles, the 5.5 guns that would then shoot over at the Cubans from a range of 20, 30 kilometers. So I just want to mention Ebo and Andre Dietrichs. This isn't Breach 14, that came later. Corporal Dietrichs, they called him Didis, was sent to reconnoiter a safe route for the infantry on foot along the western flank of Top Hat during Breach 14. He was also told to determine the location of the enemy positions covering the breach. And here we can see the whole story of what I've just told you of Breach 14. Okay, and he was one Unfortunately, just a few years later, I think in 2005, he passed away from cancer. He wrote his own book, and many stories were told about him, about subsequent operations that Andre Dietrich was involved with. And that's a separate story on Breach 14. The other person who was involved in Breach 14, or was involved in Ebo, was my Sergeant Major Berger from Tusai. And I just want to share the story with on him. And a salvo of BM-21 exploded on both mortar positions. You'll remember I just mentioned the mortar positions. Him and just 3 others were all single-handedly fighting the Cubans at Ebo. All the other troops have gone bogged down. They were either killed or injured or were trying to pull back. And here was my Sergeant Major. It is a story I find it was almost difficult to believe, because I can tell you just a little anecdote. When we drove into Angola for the first time from the border to take over Fort Rosades, Sergeant Major Berger was driving the vehicle that we were on, a Unimog, which I also knew to drive, and I was sitting at the back. And at some stage, I think he realized that he's driving into total danger. And he wasn't into that. Here's a guy, he's got a family, kids. He is like 35 or 36 at the time. So he called over to me and he said, Shochat, you know how to drive this vehicle? I said, yes. So he said, come, you're going to drive. And in the middle, now we're driving this. This is a 2-kilometer long convoy of armored cars and vehicles and you name it, driving into battle. And I climbed over. It was an open vehicle. I climbed over. He kept his foot on the gas. And I jumped into the driver's seat and he moved across next to me so that at least he had a gun if anybody shot at us, that he could kind of protect us. And I ended up driving a vehicle into the Battle of Fort Rosades with Sergeant Major Berger next to me. And then he joined me with the Angolan mercenaries. And that's another whole story in itself. So here we are. And then in Southern Madeira, we split up and he went his way, and here he ended up in Ebo itself. A salvo of BM-21 exploded on both mortar positions, leaving a number of people dead and wounded, among them Staff Benson and 14 UNITA troops, and scores others were seriously wounded. Most of them were brought to the rear by Captain Holm, who himself died, that we just mentioned. 20 or more FNLA troops also died as they were trying to seek shelter. The mortars were now within an infantry screen, and to cap it all, most of the UNITA members had all gone. You know, many of them just packed up and ran away in the middle of battle. So Lieutenant Van Niekerk decided to try again and reach the Elands, this time with a group of infantry. And on the way there, he met Sergeant Major Berger, who had somehow survived explosions and decided finally to withdraw the mortar position. Sergeant Major Berger unfortunately died 3 years later in a military vehicle accident near Messina on the South Africa-Rhodesian border in June 1978. He was just 38 years old at the time. So I said earlier, at the time, with me, he was about 35. And for his bravery in the face of the enemy, once again, he was awarded the Honorary Cross medal. So here you see, this is, I think, the 3rd or the 4th one I've covered of bravery in the line of fire. Just covering Sergeant Major Berger, we have a photo of him. We've got the South African War Graves Project. We have over here his tombstone. And let's see just what some people wrote about him. And I think over here then we'll cut and continue the stories of Breach 14 and some others in the next session. Herman van Niekerk wrote, I remember Jeff Berger very well. And yes, he was with us at Ebo. While I took Forecraft and to the medical post in the Honda, Jeff Berger went about firing at enemy positions with my mortars. Remember, I said he wasn't a mortar guy. He just took over. He was around there, but it wasn't his task. Apparently, they came under heavy fire from the BM-21s and eventually vacated. On my way back to the mortar position, he stopped me and told me not to go there as the position was definitely registered as a target, and they got hammered. Needless to say, I went back, and with Johan home following a bit later in his armored car, and he was just killed a short time after that. Herman Lessing, also from the Savannah group. I remember seeing Jeff Berger and Major Holzhausen in Grootfontein at the end of November. They were both very traumatized after their experience on the front. Traumatized. And I eventually wrote, it was this traumatic stage of mind that led him to tell people from our unit. Now, so when Jeff Berger got back to the border and he met up with other troops from SAI, so the troops hadn't seen him or me for like 2 months. So they said, where's Laurie? You know, he was with you when you guys went up into Angola. Okay. And all he could do was mumble that I was a goner. He had no idea where I was. He hadn't seen me for a good month or so. And because of what he said, what Sergeant Major Berger said, rumors spread across, and I've covered that in previous sessions, that everybody thought that I was dead, missing in action. I never actually discovered if that story officially got back to my parents. But when I got back to Walvis Bay at the end of December, and the guys from my troops, from my unit saw me, they thought they had seen a ghost. And thus I was assumed killed in action until I arrived back in Walvis Bay. So not trying to myself, I wasn't any hero, I didn't do anything, but this guy ended up, who was a meek and mild, just lovely, lovely person who I slept with next to him. We interacted together one-on-one for a good month together. And he actually became this unsung hero that most people don't even know about. And I think going forward, I think, Koos, that maybe we should stop here. And so 2 days after Ebo, we're now going to get closer to 1 or 2 other stories about a plane being a plane crash and looking for the bodies for over 30 years of a number of missing bodies. And thereafter, we're going to also cover those who died at Breach 14 itself. 2 amazing stories with long histories covering tens of years subsequent to the original event. This is a photo I took of on the tarmac at Celle Airport. You're seeing a C-130 just came in to land, and you see this Cessna plane. And this photo that I took was analyzed many, many years later, because it was this Cessna that a few hours after I took this photo, that Cessna got shot down and 3 South African officers from the Air Force were killed. We're going to cover that in the next session, and also then Bridge 14. Okay? So if you've got any questions or anything, also I hope this has been interesting, and that this is information that maybe was not totally public knowledge until now for the last 50 years.
I want to bring your attention to 2 books written by myself, and one of them is called When Does It End? And then a follow-up book called Where Does It End? It might actually have a 3rd book. I haven't written it yet, but it's in my head. I might do so or not. Called Why Did It End? Now, it's a fascinating story, these books, because it's about the Jewish army. Now, the Jewish army has got nothing to do with the Israeli army. In fact, Israel didn't even exist. We were talking here about 1942, 1943. And basically what happened was there was something called the Jewish army, which went into occupied France and other parts of Europe, and they started rescuing Jews. Now, in those days, of course, the Nazis were there, and they were trying to catch these Jews and get hold of them and murder them in the concentration camps. I don't have to explain this to you. It's well known. And it so happens that Rebecca's family on her side lost everyone in the concentration camps, those who stayed behind in Europe. On my side, with my grandmother who fled to the Union of South Africa, I believe all of them died as well. And so it's very personal to us. I wrote these books with Rebecca's assistance to educate. And would you believe, if you read the first book, When Does It End? You will find out that the Jews were not stupid. They could see this coming. They could see that it was going to happen. And therefore they started making plans to get out. But sadly, they were not welcomed. Nobody wanted them. If you read the book, and of course it's fictionalized, but the history in it is most definitely not, you will read sad cases of a ship which sailed all the way to America and they wouldn't be allowed to put their feet on American soil. And at the end of the day, they had to sail all the way back to Europe, and you can imagine what happened further. It came out in the books that Switzerland, Swineland, despite all their stories that they were so kind to the Jews and they brought all the Jews in and they took care of them, actually the truth is not really that. There's a bit of a different clue there, which you'll also discover in the books. In that 50,000, 30,000 Jews were denied entry in Switzerland because there was something wrong with their passports, or perhaps they didn't bribe the Swiss enough. I wouldn't know. Matter of historical fact. And they also died in the camps. Now, for South Africans, especially the Afrikaner like me, the word concentration camp actually refers back to the Boer War of 1902. That's when that ended, in 1899 and 1902, and that is where the British Empire, that is the British Army, yes, them, that is where they actually started hoarding Afrikaners into concentration camps. They had a scorch policy for many, many reasons. They never apologized, and 1 out of every 3 died. 1 out of every 3. It's a bitter thing. It's a very bitter thing because people don't know about it and they're astonished when they find out. Now, I've often wondered, why did the Jews during World War II and before that, why did they surrender to the Nazis? I mean, if I know I was going to be murdered in a concentration camp, I'm definitely not just going to walk voluntarily into it. I'm definitely going to fight my way out. Or I'm going to die in the process, but I will die like a man. And I understand from my Israeli friends that these type of questions are asked, were asked anyway in the Jewish community as well. On why did that happen? Now, the books do look into that. And we do look into the law, the legal system, because I'm a legal man. I understand law. I've been trained as an attorney. I practice as an attorney. So when I read laws, even if it's not my own countries, I do understand the purpose behind it. And it's a warning, which also comes out in these books. It's a warning. It can happen again. It definitely can happen again. Might not be against the Jews, but it might be against Christians. It might be against certain types of Christians, those who keep the Sabbath day. In fact, that too was predicted in the Bible. So these are very, very interesting books. If you like them, read them. If you like what I just told you and you want to know more, get hold of the books while you can. I'll put the links in the description as well. And perhaps you can know something about the history of what happened there is actually astonishing. I mean, they did rescue these Jews. They rescued a lot of Jews. They smuggled them out of Europe. There's a great gratitude towards these people, because remember, when the war ended, and this is also in the books, the Royal Navy, those Brits again, The Royal Navy actually started intercepting the old merchant ships who were taking these Jews who now survived the concentration camps. They were now going to the Holy Land, back to Palestine in those days. And so the Royal Navy started intercepting these ships, and they put them, people they could caught or they catched, they would put them back in a concentration camp, I think in Cyprus or one of those islands, which they were still controlling at that stage. It's a horror story. It's a horror story which happened here. And once again, it may happen in the future. So get hold of the books, you read them, get hold of them, support the Legacy channel. And I thank you for listening. Let's carry on and hear what the actual video is about. This was fantastic, Guy. Thank you for this. It's a thing, you know. I spoke to some people and they said to me, well, you know, when you did your basic training, whether it's in the police or in the army, you become a man. And I respectfully disagree with these people. I think you become a man when you see your own dead. And that's when you wake up to reality of war and of, you know, the terrible things which happens in life. And I'm so happy that these people can be mentioned and they are now perhaps more remembered than what they were. And I thank you for that. I'm really looking forward to the next episode. Laurie, I've seen you're wearing some kind of a dog tag. But
Yeah.
can you tell me the story, please? What is that? I've never seen a dog tag like that before.
This is like a dog tag that a lot of people here in Israel wear, saying, bring them home now. This is just a reminder, a daily reminder for all of us in Israel to remember that we have some of our own soldiers and others who were civilians, not soldiers, who were dragged out of their beds at 6:30 in the morning on the 7th of October 2023 and taken into captivity in Gaza and held hostage there for now this week, as we're recording it now, it's going to be 500 days. And most of them we've never ever heard from. Never heard a word, or they're dead or they are alive. And until such time as they're all back, we wear this. And this is the hope. And it's a dog tag because, you know, many of them were soldiers. And for those who served, be it in whatever army, and I served in South Africa, I also served in Israel, this is a very, very special thing for us. And we don't put it underneath our T-shirts. We wear it out so that everybody can see and everybody can remember.
Yes, I believe that's a tradition, which might be, of course, a much older tradition with you people, but I recall with the Iran embassy hostage, they also tied these yellow ribbons against trees in the US. I recall my wife telling me about it. She actually saw it with her own eyes. And they were only kept, I think, 444 days, and probably in much better conditions, to be honest. But I'm not allowed to speak about these things. I just wanted to bring to your attention these things are happening in the background, and our prayers are with all of them as well as with you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to receive notifications.